It goes without saying that an epic final boss encounter can help to ensure that any video gaming experience concludes in a meaningful and memorable way. And within the previous episode of our exploration into how the notion of the final boss encounter has evolved over the years within the Final Fantasy franchise, we deconstructed every final boss to have appeared from the original Final Fantasy all the way up to Dirge Cerberus Final Fantasy VII. Some interesting traits were identified. They were aligned with appearance, difficulty, and even length of encounter, and if you're coming in fresh, we'd recommend checking out part 1 via the link in the description below. As mentioned last time, this video will be filled with spoilers relating to every game, not just Final Fantasy XIV. So, to minimize this and to stop the video series becoming oversaturated, with regards to the MMOs, mobile games and other games like Final Fantasy XV, we will only be covering final bosses associated with the base game. That means, if we're isolating it to Final Fantasy XIV, we will not, for example, be talking about Endwalker. So with that in mind, let's continue exploring the complete evolution of final bosses. Final Fantasy XII spent longer in development than any previous game associated with the franchise, and as it drew towards its conclusion, players were treated with spectacular cinematics, emotionally fueled encounters, and of course, a rather epic final boss. It had been clear for some time that Vayne Solidor would serve as the primary evil that needed to be stopped, and as players headed into the final encounter, they would square off against Vayne in his base human form. This was reminiscent of the encounter against Ultimecia, and as the fight progressed, the similarities would continue, with traits from other encounters also seen. After being defeated in his human form, Vayne transformed into Vayne Novus. This was achieved by using his body as a conduit for Nethicite, and it was here that a lesser used trait would resurface, as Vayne Novus would be supported by 5 allies called Saphira. During this phase, Vayne would also start to use more pronounced unique abilities such as Azure Vortis and Contempt, but it would be the next phase that brought everything together. Having seen Vayne fail twice, Vanar decided to intervene. In an action that was reminiscent of Ultimecia's fusing with Griever, this would see Vanar merge with Vayne Solidor, pulling in parts of the Sky Fortress Bahamut to create a wholly original being known as the Undying. It was a significant transformation, and this combination of sources most definitely made the Undying seem like an otherworldly being. The nature of the transformation was also a complete surprise, as up until that point, Vanar had been a non-active participant, at least in the physical sense. With the Sky Fortress Bahamut also being part of the merger, it would see the Undying use numerous abilities that were linked with the Venerable Summon, such as Gigaflare Sword, Mega Flare, and Terra Flare. This was a new association, but there was also room for older associations to come to the fore, as the ability Piercing Elemental could also be a subtle reference back to Chaos, the original final boss. Even though Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings served as a direct follow-up to Final Fantasy XII, and it featured many of the same concepts, when it came to the final boss encounter, the two approaches couldn't have been further apart. Throughout large portions of the game, it was believed that Judge of Wings, aka Midia, was the big bad. But after Midia herself was beaten, she revealed that she was a mere pawn, acting at the behest of Fail Thanos. It meant that from a narrative perspective, the appearance of Fail Thanos was not too dissimilar to Ultimecia, but it was from a gameplay perspective that everything became a bit more interesting. After heading inside the womb of Fail Thanos, instead of coming face to face with Fail Thanos himself, the party were instead greeted by Fail Thanos Exultant, a huge demon. The fight itself would then be pretty tough, as Fail Thanos Exultant was constructed of multiple parts that were spread across the battlefield. The connection with Final Fantasy XII then came from an unlikely source, Bahamut, who would appear once the health of Fail Thanos' Medi had been reduced by half. After this encounter, the player would then square off against Fail Thanos in his regular form, and that's where a weird parallel with Sephiroth came in. Even though players could still lose the fight against Fail Thanos, the difficulty was much less when compared to the fight against Fail Thanos Exultant, assuming of course that players were paying attention. and this made the fight feel more like one based on ceremony as opposed to one where it felt like there was a genuine chance of failure. That's not all though, as there was another connection with Sephiroth. In Final Fantasy VII, the amount of health save for Sephiroth had was dependent on numerous criteria, and in Revenant Wings, Fail Thanos Exultant could also be made more difficult depending on player choice. In this case, if the player had completed every mission, Fail Thanos Exultant would be upgraded to level 99, making it one of the hardest Final Fantasy bosses in the history of the franchise, something we covered in a previous video. Given that both Before Crisis and Dirge of Cerberus had featured quite unorthodox final boss encounters, it wasn't too surprising that Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII would also feature an unorthodox conclusion. But perhaps due to its closer connection with Final Fantasy VII, the way the developers chose to have the final boss encounter feature within Crisis Core was also quite derivative. It had been a long time since the final boss had been encountered early on in the story, with the previous time this had happened being Final Fantasy VI. But with Genesis Rhapsodus a constant thorn in the side, he was fought midway through the game at an abandoned Mako excavation facility near Modeoheim. Genesis could also be fought during Mission 515, but the next narrative-based encounter would be the final boss encounter. Much like what had been seen in Final Fantasy VII with Sephiroth, this would see Genesis use the goddess materia to transform into a new being called Genesis Avatar. The encounter itself would see a few unique abilities surface, such as Overdrive and Purgatorial Wave, with Genesis Avatar also having scaling health that was dependent on the difficulty setting. But what further emphasized the connection with Final Fantasy VII was that after Genesis Avatar was defeated, Genesis would be encountered, with this fight being much easier by comparison. This was also very reminiscent of Revenant Wings, something that must have been coincidental as the two games were only released 5 months apart in Japan and had completely different development teams. Within the second encounter, which would also see Genesis have differing HP levels depending on the difficulty level selected, the player would be subjected to a much wider array of unique abilities such as Dancing Sword and Twister Strike. Genesis would also use Apocalypse, an ability that had previously been used by Ultima Seer. However, in this game, Apocalypse was not unique to the final boss, as the player could also make use of this ability through the DMW system. Final Fantasy Tactics XIII would feature a rather unorthodox final boss, both in terms of how it was presented from a visual perspective and from a gameplay perspective. Throughout, the party would be attempting to thwart the schemes of Allura. One of the earlier skirmishes would land the party in Zelia, where they would encounter a demon called Nekia, or at least they'd encounter a small part of Nekia. This would be quite foreboding, and it represented an interesting twist. In previous games, such as Final Fantasy II and VI, where the main antagonist also served as the final boss, there were easier encounters that took place before the final showdown. But where this differed in Tactics XIII was that Nekia was not the main antagonist. And as such, that Nekia was encountered partway through the story was meant more as a way to tease the challenge ahead, as opposed to something that would help drive the story forward. That challenge manifested as Nekia was revealed as the final boss, with players realizing that the encounter they had before was only against its hand. Nekia in its full form was far more monstrous, with it being so large that it was even integrated into the stage itself as a way of navigating to the various parts. Not only was this a huge challenge in comparison to previous final bosses who had been large but not that large, it was also a nice twist on the transformation aspect, as Nekia had not changed its form from the first encounter to the last, but the player's perception had. What was also very intriguing about Nekia was how its ability set pulled from the past. It would see Nekia have access to a huge array of unique abilities, with two very noticeable ones being Grand Cross and Apocalypse. With Dissidia acting as a pretty solid tribute to the entire franchise, it was rather fitting that Chaos, who started it all back in 1987, would return as the main antagonist and final boss. However, even though its appearance was inspired by the original Final Fantasy, this was not the same Chaos, and this meant its motivations, after being driven insane, were to create a world where nothing could exist. With the genre change, some of the established traits were stripped away, and there was no big physical transformation at the commencement of the encounter. However, there was at least one core trait retained, as Chaos would need to be defeated in 3 consecutive instances without the player being defeated once. As the fight progressed, players would then bear witness to perhaps the most extreme transformation to date, as Chaos would go from being comparable in size to the player's character to dwarfing them. During this portion of the fight, Chaos would also wield 4 giant swords, with the entire moveset changing, but it would ultimately not be enough to prevent skilled players from defeating Chaos and winning the encounter. With Final Fantasy the Four Heroes of Light having its roots in some of the earliest entries into the franchise, the traits associated with the final boss would end up being rather fitting. It would see Chaos return yet again to serve as the final boss, but even though this particular iteration had the same name, there was very little in common, from a gameplay perspective at least, with the original final boss. The fight would consist of 3 phases, with the initial phase being against Chaos in its default human form, but even though it would prove a challenge, similar to previous final boss encounters, the human form would only serve as an appetizer. After transforming, Chaos would see a significant increase to its damage output, and to pay tribute to the original Chaos, it would start using spells such as Blaze and Tsunami. At the conclusion of the second phase, a trait only previously seen within Final Fantasy XI would resurface, as the player would be healed before the final phase commenced. This would then see a further transformation, and in this final form, Chaos would not only gain new appendages, but it would gain access to 2 new moves, Big Bang and Black Hole. On the surface, this might have felt quite random, as they were previously associated with Zeromus, but prior to working on the Four Heroes of Light, the development team had worked on the Final Fantasy IV Remake on the Nintendo DS. Takashi Tokita was also a prominent part of all 3 projects, having been the lead designer for Final Fantasy IV when it released on the Super Famicom, the director of the Nintendo DS 3D Remake, and the director of the Four Heroes of Light. For much of Final Fantasy XIII, players found themselves squaring off against a fal'Cie known as Barthandelus. But right as the game reached its conclusion and Barthandelus was defeated, the rug was pulled out and Orphan, another fal'Cie, was revealed as the final boss. Like many of the earlier final bosses, Orphan was only able to exist following the defeat of the previous foe. The main difference was that whereas in those instances hatred or malice were the overriding emotions at play, the birth of Orphan was a purposeful act on the part of another fal'Cie called Minerva, and Orphan even thanked the player for the part they played in bringing it to life. The fight itself would feel reminiscent of Final Fantasy VII, where the recurring boss, in that case Jenova, would act as a prelude to the final boss. Sephiroth would then be split into 2 main encounters, with the third being ceremonial. Final Fantasy XIII was a close match, with Barthandelus being fought as a prelude before 2 very different encounters against Orphan. In the first of these encounters, the player would need to contend with numerous unique abilities such as Kaleidoscopic Ray and the bane of most players, Progenitorial Wrath, a move that could inflict instant death. After being defeated, a second encounter would ensue, but even though there would be no chance for rest or changing equipment within the natural intended flow, should the player be defeated or simply want to retry things if they weren't going as planned, the start of the second encounter would serve as a new checkpoint. This time, Orphan would have reduced HP, a trait seen many times before with multi-stage final bosses. But even though that was the case, and moves such as Progenitorial Wrath were no longer used, the fight was not easy. Part of this was due to Orphan's now incredibly high defensive stats. This meant it would need to be staggered to be damaged. The other factor was that a time limit was placed on the encounter thanks to Doom being cast at its commencement. Orphan also introduced a very interesting trait, a specific weakness. Whereas the first encounter could end in a frustrating manner due to instant death, so too could the second encounter, but this time it would be in the player's favour. When staggered, there was a chance that Orphan could be defeated via instant death, but the chance was quite low. As shared within the Final Fantasy XIII Ultimania, this weakness was included as a tribute back to the creator, the final boss in the original Saga game, which had a connection to Final Fantasy due to the name being used for its North American release. As Final Fantasy Dimensions was created by the same team that worked on the Four Heroes of Light, there were quite a few similarities in terms of the thematic makeup of the final boss. Elgo was a consistent presence throughout the narrative, with the player led to believe they were actually an ally. But in a shock twist, it turned out that Elgo was in fact the main evildoer. As the game reached its conclusion, Elgo would be faced in a two-stage encounter, but after their defeat, everything went sideways and a surprise final boss appeared, Chaos Elgo. This continued the association between Chaos and the final boss, but there was also an association between Chaos Elgo and previous bosses featured within works produced by the same development team. For example, Chaos Elgo would not only use Big Bang, but also Black Hole, two abilities used by Chaos in the Four Heroes of Light, as well as Zeromus. Chaos Elgo would also tweak the typical formula. This would see the fight feature subtle phases with emphasis placed on in-phase transformations as opposed to transformations signifying the start of a new phase. This would manifest during the second phase as Chaos Elgo could switch between 3 unique forms, something that would affect the abilities it could use. With Final Fantasy XIV following in the footsteps of Final Fantasy XI, there was a high degree of anticipation. But due to the game's dismal performance at launch, main story progression took a back seat as the development team attempted to fix more pressing issues. It meant that even though Final Fantasy XIV released towards the end of 2010, it wouldn't be until mid-August 2012, some 653 days later, that players would be able to witness a conclusion to the base game. That conclusion came in the form of a rather lengthy encounter against Nail Vandanas as part of the Riven Road trial, which was added in patch 1.23a. The fight consisted of 2 phases, with the first against Nail Vandanas' standard form. However, within this phase were micro phases. In the initial sense, Nail would only use melee attacks, but after being reduced to 75% of its health, things would kick up a notch. As it progressed, Nail would also be able to summon lunar fragments to aid their cause, and they would deal significant damage if allowed to fall. After being defeated, Nail would request more power, something that would see Nail Vandanas transformed into Nail Deusdanas. The second phase would play out in similar fashion to the first phase, but from a design perspective, there was an intriguing addition, as Nail Deusdanas could use Mega Flare, an ability not associated with the final boss since Final Fantasy XII and Mystic Quest before that. Whereas the original Dissidia featured a modernised version of an iconic final boss, its sequel, Dissidia Duodecim, decided to throw out the rulebook. Unlike every previous Final Fantasy game, this meant Duodecim did not feature a final boss, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, as the game drew to its conclusion, the player would take control of 5 conventional fights, albeit of increased difficulty. It meant there was no single entity that was the main focal point, and only once each fight had been won, with the final duel, seeing Lightning square off against Garland, would the game reach its conclusion. With Final Fantasy Type 0 spending a considerable amount of time in development, there was a lot of expectation ahead of its release. And as the game drew to its conclusion, players got to witness a final boss that was rather substantial. For a while, Sid Alstein had been positioned as the big bad, but after his scheme ended in complete failure, Sid was transformed into a new being called the Rurson Arbiter. The fight itself would end up being quite the spectacle, with players taken to a lavish stage to fight against their new foe. They would also find that the Rurson Arbiter could not be harmed, and the fight would only progress after the entire party had been defeated. This would serve as an extreme throwback to Zirconade, the final boss of Before Crisis, which made sense as Hajime Tabata, the director of Type 0, also directed Before Crisis. It would only be during the second phase that the Rurson Arbiter could be harmed, but the mechanics were not as simple as just dealing damage. Each party member would need to land a break site and then absorb the Phantoma that was released. This would gradually weaken the Rurson Arbiter, making it something of an inverse encounter. Players would start the second phase with likely their strongest party setup, squaring off against the Rurson Arbiter in its strongest form, but as the weaker and weaker party members were forced into the fray, the Rurson Arbiter would also weaken. Final Fantasy XIII-2 introduced a brand new antagonist who did not feature within the original game, but from a mechanical perspective, Caius Ballad was not too dissimilar from Bartandalus. Both would be encountered numerous times throughout the game, with Caius taking this to extreme levels. However, after it became clear to Caius that he could not win after one of the final encounters, he would end up transforming into something much grander, Jet Bahamut. Even though some previous bosses had shown associations with Bahamut, such as the Undying from Final Fantasy XII, this was the first instance where the association was made quite literal. And as if being named Jet Bahamut wasn't enough, the encounter also included Amber Bahamut and Garnet Bahamut. Unlike previous add-ons, such as the Pagodas in Final Fantasy XII or even the Ultimate Demons in Final Fantasy Tactics, Amber and Garnet were active participants in the fight, and it was only when they were incapacitated that Jet Bahamut could even be targeted. Leaning on Bahamut's traits, Jet Bahamut would be able to use Giga Flare and Terra Flare, but Mega Flare was replaced by Exa Flare. It's unclear why this decision was made, but these moves aligned with the variants of Bahamut which had appeared within the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. These extreme moves, which could be enhanced should Amber or Garnet not be defeated quickly enough, would then be supplemented by a whole host of unique abilities like Abyssal Yawn and Judgment Blade. Instead of continuing to try and fix Final Fantasy XIV, the development team realised they would need to do a much more literal reset. The result was Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. In reality, many elements did carry over, including Nail Vandanas, but roles were changed according to the new plan, and it meant Nail no longer featured as the final boss for the base game. That role was instead given to a new character called La Habrea. Players were aware of La Habrea throughout much of the story related to the base game, and he would serve as the final boss of the main scenario quest called The Ultimate Weapon that was associated with patch 2.0. The fight, back when A Realm Reborn launched, was associated with a dungeon called the Praetorium. Within, players would need to fight through a gauntlet of bosses that included Nero, Gaius, and Ultimate Weapon before then squaring off against La Habrea. This series featured quite a few interesting nuances in comparison to what had been seen before. For example, La Habrea would have an involvement in the fight against Ultimate Weapon, leading players to believe that once the fight concluded, the story would progress. Another twist was that in the fight that followed, players would not actually be fighting against La Habrea, at least in the literal sense. Instead, players had to fight against Thancred, who was being mind-controlled by La Habrea. This final encounter would also be much easier than the fight against Ultimate Weapon, resurfacing a trait seen a handful of times before, where the final leg of the final boss gauntlet would be more ceremonial than there to push players to the limits of their abilities. As such, the fight against mind-controlled Thancred wasn't all that comprehensive, but there was a connection with Final Fantasy VII. This came through the Shadow Flare ability, which was used by both Thancred, Safer Sephiroth, and Genesis Avatar. Now, this was how the fight used to be, but due to the ever-evolving nature of Final Fantasy XIV, much of this has changed, and as of patch 6.1, everything just spoken about no longer exists. This means that instead of facing La Habrea as part of a gauntlet within the Praetorium, it's now a solo quest battle that has been elevated in status. As such, the encounter is no longer ceremonial, with La Habrea's ability set expanded in a significant manner, and the encounter having two distinct phases. The first phase will be similar to other more recent final boss encounters, with the player taking part in an unwinnable encounter. However, following the intervention of a third party, in this case Hydaelyn, they will be revived and given a second bite of the cherry. During the second phase, the player would receive the Blessing of Light status. This would increase damage and health, making the fight more sustainable, and although La Habrea would put up a significant challenge, the player would be able to overcome the odds. That such a change was made to the makeup of this part of Final Fantasy XIV served as evidence that the development team want to ensure the entire experience is of the highest quality, as opposed to accolades only being geared towards the most recent expansions. As the third iteration into the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, Lightning Returns mixed things up by ditching the classic party dynamic. This saw focus placed firmly on Lightning, with players able to control her actions in combat via the style change active time battle system. Based on this, the narrative was also narrowed in focus, with many previous characters appearing in cameo roles and a new antagonist introduced called Benevelza. Acting as both the main antagonist and the final boss, Benevelza was a consistent presence throughout. As such, it meant there was no real surprise element, but due to its role within the narrative, there was definitely an otherworldly element to its design. In spite of Lightning Returns moving away from many established elements, the final boss encounter would end up being very nostalgic, adopting many traits seen throughout the years, often in blatant fashion. The fight would have 4 distinct phases, with Benevelza gaining new abilities with each new phase, as well as an ever-increasing pool of HP. In the initial phase, this would include Almagest, a move previously used by Exdeath, but as the fight extended, Benevolza would gain access to Heartless Angel, a move made famous by both Kefka and Sephiroth. Beyond that, there were numerous illusions. Falling Star and Genethliac Hymn both had a strong similarity with Starfall, a move used by the Emperor in Final Fantasy II, and then Dissidia. Wings of Destruction was similar to Havoc Wing, another move used by Kefka. Divine Punishment was used by Chaos in Dissidia, and Hypernova would serve as another illusion to Sephiroth via Supernova. The other interesting trait was that Benevolza had adaptive HP. In the initial instance, this would be dependent on the difficulty the game was being played on, which was identical to what was seen within Crisis Core, but when playing on New Game Plus, Benevolza would be replaced by Benevolza Plus, but only if the player had completed the bonus dungeon known as the Ultimate Layer. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 featured numerous changes in comparison to the original game, but its final boss, Neo Chaos Bahamut, would end up being rather spectacular and would feature numerous established traits. Chaos Bahamut would emerge as an antagonist as the story of Dimensions 2 developed, and based on its name, there were clear connections with both the original Chaos, but also Bahamut. However, Chaos Bahamut would only serve as an appetizer. As the game reached its conclusion, Chaos Bahamut would be encountered numerous times. However, as seen with Zirconade in Before Crisis, the player would be unable to win despite having numerous attempts. It would only be after Muti used the power of Mega Flare that Chaos Bahamut would fall, but this would only give rise to the true final boss, Neo Chaos Bahamut. The illusions here were very obvious, as the name itself drew from the original final boss, Chaos, and the final boss of Final Fantasy V, Neo Exdeath, and it further strengthened the association between Bahamut and final bosses. The fight itself will consist of 3 phases, due to Dimensions 2 adopting the typical mobile mechanic of having 3 waves per encounter, and during each stage, Neo Chaos Bahamut would gain progressively more HP. For Mobius Final Fantasy, the developers wanted to offer an alternative retelling of the original story, and this saw Chaos return as both the main antagonist and the final boss of Season 1. However, unlike the original game, Chaos was not Garland. Chaos was once human, but for the final encounter he was transformed into a huge obelisk. Ahead of the encounter's second phase, Chaos would then transform again, this time into a demonic creature that was much more representative of the original Chaos's design. Chaos would then make use of numerous abilities such as Flood of Despair and Chaotic Whispers, but outside of there being an association with the original Chaos, the other final boss traits were quite loose in comparison to many previous final bosses. At the conclusion of the initial season of Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, players squared off against another amalgamation of previous final bosses called Chaotic Darkness. Its name pulled from the recurring chaos element and the notion of darkness, something that was quite literal in terms of the naming in Final Fantasy III. But beyond that, its existence was reminiscent of earlier games too, as it was formed as a result of the cumulative evil found in the hearts of humans over the course of history. In the initial sense, there was a slight variation, as the chaotic darkness was not a being as such. Instead, it was a weird mass, but after being unsuccessfully wielded as a weapon by Sol, the chaotic darkness would transform into an otherworldly being. It would then fall upon the party to defeat the chaotic darkness to stop it from indiscriminately obliterating the world. During the encounter itself, players would find a somewhat regressive final boss, at least compared to what had come before, as even though its lore was aligned, its ability set was reduced with no noticeable callbacks, and the encounter itself only consisted of 1 phase. Shinryu appeared in both the original Dissidia and its sequel, Dissidia Duodecim. Both times Shinryu was a summonable ally, but in Duodecim, a variant called Shinryu Verus also appeared, wielded by an evil force, and this was somewhat foreboding, as in Dissidia NT, Shinryu would serve as the main antagonist and final boss. Such was the threat posed by Shinryu that both the champions of Materia and Spiritus agreed to work together in order to try and bring about its demise, and the fight itself would prove quite troublesome. Harkening back to the original final boss, Chaos, Shinryu would use a variety of elemental attacks, and after its health was whittled down, it would then enter into a second phase. During this phase, Shinryu could use enhanced elemental attacks, each of which was tied back to the various other summonable beasts present in Dissidia NT. As the story of World of Final Fantasy built to a close, what players got to witness was something both unexpected, but also expected. From a narrative perspective, things would end up getting pretty wild, and there would be some definite surprises, but from a mechanical perspective, the final boss, XIII Bahamut, would fulfill many traits associated with previous final bosses. First, it would continue the trend of Bahamut being associated with the final boss, with perhaps it being the most literal manifestation of that particular trait, as Brandelis was a Bahamut. After defeating a gauntlet of previous bosses, the players would then face XIII Bahamut for the first time, but in typical style, even though the encounter was tough, it would not be the final encounter. Instead, XIII Bahamut would transform into a much more fantastical version of its former self. During the encounter, XIII Bahamut would have access to a wide array of abilities, with Mega Flare Cannon appearing as a recurring ability for both Bahamut and some previous final bosses. XIII Bahamut would also have an intriguing mechanic, as unlike some previous bosses where phases would be used to increase difficulty of the encounter, for this particular fight, XIII Bahamut's agility would consistently increase as its HP decreased. This meant it would get faster and faster turns, making the fight quite troublesome to manage in its final stages.
I'm afraid you're out of luck.
Even before Final Fantasy XV released, it was clear who the main antagonist would be, as Arden Izunia was front and centre in terms of promotional materials, including Kingsglaive. However, even though that was the case, there was no guarantee that Arden would still end up being the final boss, as so many times before, some greater power would emerge as the true villain. When looking at the wider Final Fantasy XV universe, that would end up being true, but within the base game, Arden fulfilled every major antagonistic role, and what we saw from the final boss encounter would have some strong parallels with a few previous final bosses. Perhaps the most interesting element was that there would be no specific transformation, at least in the otherworldly sense. Much like Shuyin, this meant the Arden we saw at the beginning was the Arden we saw at the end, and in many ways this would end up being quite unnerving, as that lovable Arden smarminess was still there even when he was fighting to the death. However, unlike the fight against Shuyin, the final boss encounter against Arden still had distinct phases. During the initial phase, Arden would use basic attacks to mirror that of Noctis. This would see him able to use warp strikes and the royal arms, and quicktime events were scattered throughout to add a sense of urgency. This would then give way to a second phase. During this phase, Arden would undergo a small transformation, as he would gain access to the Armiger, something that would be accompanied by a red glow. The final phase would then be slight by comparison. It would see Arden act more like a wounded animal, stumbling around, seeming to pose no real challenge. However, he could still strike and deal incredible damage when catching the player by surprise. In this way, the final phase was much more there for ceremonial purposes than anything else, and it was quite representative of previous encounters against the likes of Fail Thanos and Genesis. When the Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced, most players who were familiar with the original had a pretty strong feeling that Sephiroth would return as the final boss of the overarching story, as, well, that's what happened in the original game. But with the experience split into multiple parts, there was much less certainty around who would appear as the final boss of Remake, and when it turned out to be Sephiroth, it caught a lot of people by surprise. Sephiroth would appear at the conclusion of the multi-stage boss encounter against the Whisper Harbinger, but as a continuation of a more recent trend, and perhaps because the Whisper Harbinger had been so fantastical, as well as the developers wanting to ensure there was room for growth within future parts, Sephiroth would just appear in his regular human form. The encounter would be far from basic, however. Split into 4 distinct phases, the initial phase would represent a first for a final boss encounter. Perhaps to juxtapose the final encounter of Final Fantasy VII, it would see the party stripped away, and Cloud would need to square off against Sephiroth by himself. Upon the completion of this phase, Cloud would then be joined by another party member, and this resurfaced a trait not seen for many years in relation to a final boss, party selection. For a while, It was believed that who joined Cloud in battle for the second and third phases was random, much like it was in Final Fantasy VIII. However, it's now known that it's dependent on the specific actions taken in the previous encounter against the Whisper Harbinger. This elevated the notion beyond the specific selection role players had in Final Fantasy VI and VII, as even though the player still had choice and it would align with player preference, it was now much more dynamic. Throughout the first 3 phases, Sephiroth would use a plethora of powerful abilities to try and defeat the party. Many had become prominent parts of the Sephiroth toolkit over the years, such as Octaslash, Hell's Gate and Shadow Flare, with Heartless Angel also returning. But in the final phase, there was an interesting twist. Countdown timers associated with big moves were not a new mechanic, but Divine Proclamation added a degree of jeopardy rarely seen before. Much like Orphan in Final Fantasy XIII, who used Doom to provide a defined endpoint for the fight on its own terms, Divine Proclamation would also see a conclusion to the fight in Sephiroth's favour if he was not defeated before the countdown timer ended. With Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin having a direct connection with the original Final Fantasy, many players expected everything to come full circle, and this notion extended to the final boss encounter. This feeling became even more pronounced every time Jack mentioned the word Chaos, but the surprise was that Chaos was not the final boss, at least not by name. Instead, players squared off against Darkness Manifest, who was essentially an exact visual replica of the original Chaos. The fight itself would be a pretty standard affair, at least in comparison to many previous final boss encounters. This would see the encounter split into 2 distinct phases, with each offering a distinct challenge. However, unlike the previous boss encounters in Stranger of Paradise, where the second phase would see the difficulty really ramp up, against Darkness Manifest, this wasn't quite the case. And this also represented an evolution, as instead of the final boss getting stronger or weaker, it was the player character who got stronger. By gaining Dark Aura powers, this meant for the second phase, Jack's break gauge would never go down, nor would Jack's mana. The knock-on effect of this would mean the use of abilities with no cost, unlimited use of Soul Burst without any fear of getting broken, and blocking with no consequence. Darkness Manifest would adapt its moveset to try and accommodate, but due to these power-ups, the second phase was more so different than more difficult. That the final boss of Stranger of Paradise flipped the switch in such a manner was rather fitting, especially given the nature of the game, and it further demonstrated that unlike some other evolutionary topics, which showed evidence of stagnation as the topic continued to develop and expand, this has not been the case with final bosses. Given that the element of surprise is one of the core tenets of the final boss, that can't be too surprising, but what's been evidenced, especially within the past 5 to 10 years, is that even though there's still plenty of traits being carried through, the developers are still finding new ways to evolve the final boss encounter, which, after this many games and this many final bosses, has to be commended. And this just makes us all the more excited to check out Final Fantasy XVI to see how Hiroshi Takai, Kazutoyo Maehiro, and Naoki Yoshida will attempt to surprise players yet again, hopefully creating an epic final showdown that will be remembered for decades to come. And with that, we're at the end of this particular evolutionary study. It's been by far the longest study we've produced to date, and we'd like to thank our Patreon supporters for suggesting we cover this topic. Now, we don't often talk about this, but compiling this video and making it into something that was coherent involved hours upon hours of research, writing, recording, re-recording, and editing between myself and Vlad, the video editor who works with me, to make sure that Evolution's videos are as good as they can be. We therefore hope it has delivered on your expectations. If you would like to support the channel to ensure we can continue to create long-form content like this, then we encourage you to pledge on Patreon. There are numerous tiers available, with the Warrior of Light tier offering voting rights, and this is something that is crucial for helping to influence the content we create each month. You can find out more by visiting patreon.com/ffunion or by clicking on the link in the description below. We would also love to hear in the comments which game you feel features the perfect final boss. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving us a like. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to give a big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galcian D. Kujata, Gregory and Lord of Morning, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.